cultural similarities and differences will become increasingly important. Confucius deals specifically with his political philosophy in the 13th book of his sayings. This starts with some basic, no-nonsense advice. Zhu Lu asked about government. The master said, "Encourage people to work hard by setting an example." Zhu Lu asked what more he should do. The master replied, "Never slacken your efforts." When he was asked how to run government, Confucius replied, "Show leniency towards minor mistakes and promote men of talent." But how does one recognize men of talent? The master said, "Promote those you yourself recognize. Those whom you do not recognize will come through of their own accord." But the master soon transcends such banalities. When asked the first thing he would do if he were put in charge of the government, Confucius replied, "First of all, I would make sure that everything was named correctly." Really? Isn't that a little obtuse? What an ignorant clod you are! When you can't speak about something, you should remain silent. Having admonished his unfortunate disciple, Confucius went on to outline his linguistic theory of government. If the names are not correct, language is without an object. When language has no object, nothing can be done properly. When nothing is done properly, the rituals fall into disarray. Music becomes discordant, and punishments no longer fit the crime. When the punishment no longer fits the crime, no one knows where they are. Therefore, whatever one conceives of, one must be able to put into communicable speech, and whatever one says, one must be able to do. Where language is concerned, precision is of the utmost importance. Nothing must be left open to chance misinterpretation. This is all very well, but as your first priority? Indeed, one may wonder what all this has to do with government. For centuries, incomprehensible directives have been an integral part of government. Confucius persists with this approach in regard to his next topic. Asked about the practice of agriculture, he offers a lengthy reply which has nothing to do with agriculture. Fan Chi asked Confucius to teach him how to grow crops. The master replied, "I am not as good as an old farmer." He then asked to be taught how to grow vegetables. Confucius replied, "I am not as good as an old gardener." When Fan Chi left, the master exclaimed, "What an ignorant clod he is! When their superiors devote themselves to the rituals, none of the common people will dare to be irreverent. When they devote themselves to justice, none will dare to be disobedient. When they devote themselves to trustworthiness, none will dare to be insincere. Where such things are practiced, people will flock from far and wide with their babies strapped to their backs. What's the point in talking about growing crops?" Confucius then appears to take a contrary stance. Having disparaged practical ability, he now points out its superiority over refinement. Consider a man who can recite all 300 poems in the traditional Book of Songs. You give him an official post, but he turns out to be incompetent. You send him abroad on a diplomatic mission, but he proves incapable of using his initiative. What use are all those poems, no matter how many he has learned? The cultivation imparted by poetry is no different from the cultivation of turnips. Both are equally useless in the cultivation of gen. When someone possesses this quality, all else follows. If a ruler himself is upright in his own person, then there will be obedience without orders having to be given. But if he himself is not upright, there will not be obedience even if orders are given. Like so much of Confucius, this is laudable, but in practice sheer fantasy. Human nature being what it is, people obey a bloodthirsty tyrant with much more alacrity than they do an upright and humane ruler with good intentions. Why then is such advice laudable? Because Confucius was trying to improve the behavior of the abominable and unscrupulous rulers of his time. Any attempt to improve matters deserves commendation, but in choosing this course, Confucius limits the relevance of his advice to a particular time and a particular place. All political advice suffers to a degree from this defect. The more pertinent it is, the quicker it becomes redundant. We only have to compare Confucius's political advice with that other great work of political instruction, Machiavelli's The Prince. Confucius's political wish-fulfillment would have been irrelevant in Renaissance Italy. many of whose rulers were great believers in inspiring their people with cultured and exemplary behavior. Machiavelli's writing was intended to open the eyes of a ruler to political reality. Bad behavior wins every time. By the same token, the prince would have been redundant in the hands of any Chinese warlord of the late Qin Dynasty. Such unscrupulous opportunism and vicious untrustworthiness were second nature there, essential requirements for any Qin ruler who wished to retain his job. Confucius was merely attempting to rectify the balance in favor of a more civilized outlook. Central to Confucius's achievement was his ability as an educator. The main purpose of his school was to produce civil servants who could propagate his social and political ideas, the cultivation of human behavior and a compassionate society. He always stressed that the achievement of Zhen was not for the benefit of the individual, but for society as a whole. He cultivates himself so that he can bring peace and happiness to all the people. These new administrators were expected to see their work as a vocation rather than merely a means to advancement and self-aggrandizement. It is shameful to make salary your whole object. The upright man should not be worried about poverty. Despite his respect for the class system in politics, Confucius had no truck with it in his school. He believed in education for all, regardless of their class. At this time, education was confined to the upper classes, so his open-door policy provided an exceptional opportunity for many who would otherwise have spent a life of drudgery and humiliation. As a result, most of Confucius's pupils came from lower-class backgrounds, and were to remain loyal and grateful to their master throughout their lives. In this way, Confucius was responsible for an injection of new talent as well as new ideas into the civil service of his region. He was well aware of what he was doing. Where there is education, there are no class distinctions. Sadly, in our eyes, this again is bound to appear as laudable fantasy. Yet, despite this covert egalitarianism, Confucius retained certain prejudices. It is wrong for a gentleman to have knowledge of menial matters, and proper that he should be entrusted with great responsibilities. It is wrong for a small man to be entrusted with great responsibilities, but proper that he should have a knowledge of menial matters. Confucius was an excellent teacher, and many of his pupils went on to become highly successful administrators, somewhat to the chagrin of their aging master, who continued scouring the help-wanted scrolls without success. Wisely, Confucius's pupils would set aside many of his more unworkable principles as soon as they entered the real world of government. Advocating humane and revolutionary ideas would only have helped them to get a job in the boys' choir. Yet this first Confucian generation of ably educated administrators didn't forget their great teacher and what he had taught them. They formed a kind of Masonic fraternity, and their education certainly affected the way they continued to live as well as their attitude toward their work. The first seeds of a new enlightenment were being sown. From now on, few seriously believed that their rulers were descended from divine ancestors ruling by heavenly decree. It was understood that the state could indeed become a cooperative undertaking of the benefit of all, and the new administrators did their best to dissuade their masters from embarking upon senseless wars. Among Confucius's pupils were a number of scions from influential families, usually from other provinces. But eventually a few curious members of the ruling family of Lu began to turn up at his lectures. In this way Confucius met the future ruling prince of Lu, Yang Hao, not to be confused with his notorious predecessor, Yang Hu, who became an object of derision, ha-ha, after his regime turned into an increasing hoo-ha. Yang Hao was impressed by Confucius, and when he took power, he appointed the middle-aged philosopher Minister of Crime. At last, Confucius could put his principles into practice. According to all reports, Confucius was a huge success as Minister of Crime, though this seems to have had little to do with his much-vaunted principles. Confucius conducted a reign of terror against local criminals. So long as he was in office, there were no robbers in the land of Lu, writes his biographer H.G. Creel. Confucius even went so far as to establish the death penalty for inventing unusual clothing, and soon things became so orderly throughout the province that The men were careful to walk on the right of the road, the women on the left. Eventually it was decided that enough was enough. Someone offered the chief minister a bribe of 80 beautiful young girls to get rid of Confucius. The chief minister, who had not had the benefit of a Confucian education, found himself unable to refuse this exhaustively challenging offer. Confucius was released